the side. I'm going to get them out of the way, and it's going to make a little bit more sense in a second here. You'll also notice which way the shelter is rolled up. So all I need to do is I'm going to roll this shelter over in the bag, just like I'm going to start unrolling the shelter. I just want to take the bag off. Yep. Hot holes in my boots. So we'll unroll and open up. Hot hole. That's all I need to do right now. Now we left our inflation hose attached, so all I need to do is kind of find my inflation hose. It'll be tucked right in here. It's great. Right there. Now if we can take our inflator pump, all we're going to do is hook our inflator pump to the inflation hose. That is a, good job, other side. That is the inflation and deflation. The toggle switch is on the inflation side. So if I hook that hose up, there's also a retainer loop, a little hose clamp. You want to be sure that that is snug down to the inflation pump, because once I turn that on, otherwise it'll blow the hose off as soon as it gets some pressure. Wow, there you go. Hardest part of deploying the shelter right now. I generally say that this is a two-person job, not because it requires any labor, but just for safety. I normally put one person on the inflation side so you can monitor the pump, ensure that you can turn the pump off in case anything unforeseen happens as the shelter deploys. The second person I normally put on this corner over here, because I know my shelter is going to unroll and it's going to unfold. I don't want to hit anybody on this side, so this person is just standing here really for safety. Ensure that nobody walks in the way of the shelter. Same holds true again for the 400 and the 600. If you're ready, you can deploy the shelter all by yourself. All the shelters will completely auto-deploy. They're going to unroll, they're going to unfold, and they're going to pop themselves up. The Model 215 with the standard inflation pump will take about 3 3.5 minutes. The Model 400 will probably take about 4.5 projects. The 600 will probably take about 6.5 seconds. So again, we have 2 people that are just watching for safety. At this point in time, we have our plumbing lines that are laying outside the shelter. We can be hooking up our water line. We've got an LED attachment point for our interior lighting. As the shelter is in place to fill up, you can be connecting your electrical, you can be connecting your water, and everything else you need to make sure you're ready to go as soon as the can is filled. This inflation pump does not have enough juice to overinflate the shelter. I can leave this run all day long. I'm not going to damage the shelter. That being said, I like to ensure that I've got as much air in this frame and it's as rigid as possible, okay? I just heard that pitch change a little bit, so I do know that that pump is working pretty hard to put more air into the shelter. So what I do by way of operation, just to be sure it's filled and just to be sure that everything, I'm happy with the footprint, is I've got these padded handles on all 4 corners for shelter. I'm going to walk around the perimeter of the shelter, and I'm just going to pull out on all 4 handles. I just want to be sure that I don't have any wrinkles or creases in my floor and everything is flat as possible. The other thing I'm going to do while my pump is still running is I'm going to duct inside my shelter because we have a containment berm built into this, okay? So I'm going to duck inside my shelter. I'm going to make sure that my valve here is closed. And when I pull this is actually a reverse thread, so I unthread it. If it stops, that tells me that it's closed. I'm going to put my little safety cap on. I'm going to come over to my airframe, this bleed line, and I'm going to open this up. And now I'm going to be filling up my containment berm.
Okay, so that goes on first, then you turn that on.
Correct.
All right. Thank you.
There's only one of them. What's that? It's just one of them, yep. So I generally leave the pump running when I do this. The reason I do that is this thing has quite a bit of air in it. And if I just bleed off the frame, I'm taking a lot of air out of the frame. But once I'm here, that's nice and rigid. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this valve again, and I'll talk about that more specifically once we step inside the shelter. And now we can go ahead and turn our pump off.
What you just did, sir.
Well, let's get everybody together here.
Hey, bring it around. Yeah, you just did something important. I heard air. He pulled something.
Everybody gather around on this corner, please. Okay. Let's touch again on what the process was here. So I hooked up the pump. I let the pump deploy the shelter. I let the pump running, and I went and I pulled on all four corners of the shelter to snug it up. Let's be sure I don't have any wrinkles in the floor and everything is lying flat exactly how I want it. With the pump still running, I went in and I closed the valve to my containment berm, and then I opened the bleed valve on the inside of the frame, that red line. The pump is going to continue to inflate the shelter and pass air on to my containment berm. Once the containment berm was filled up, I closed that bleed valve, and then I came outside the shelter, and with my push-pull valve here, I pulled it out, which is now in the closed position, and I turned my pump off. I'm now ready for operations. A couple of notes about why some of those steps. So when we pack this shelter up, and of course I'm going to show you this specifically, but when we pack the shelter up, we open the valve on that containment berm. We want to get all the air out, but my deflation pump isn't necessarily going to be able to pull a lot of air through that little thin bleeder line. That's why I need to deflate the berm manually. I leave it open when I pack the shelter up to ensure air continues to squish out of it as I fold and roll the shelter, and I can fold the shelter up compactly. That's why when the canopy pops up, I've got to close that valve. The bleeder line has a valve on it as well. The reason I want that to be closed during operations is as people are stepping over this containment berm, while it's a real heavy neoprene material and while it has a double layer of protection on it, in case anybody over any time should step on that berm, pierce that berm, put a hole in that berm, it's not going to affect your airframe now. So it's a closed system. And that's why we close that valve, just as a little bit of redundancy in case anything should ever happen to that containment berm, okay? Let's talk specifically about our fill mechanisms now. And what I'm going to do, bear with me because this is a larger group, we're going to start on this corner. We're going to walk around the outside of the shelter to show you features and how to do things on the outside of the shelter. Then we're going to move inside the shelter and do the exact same. Once we're done going through the inside of the shelter, we're going to hit on the accessories, which is all the kit we have behind the group here. And that's when we're going to start making adjustments. We're going to cut you guys loose to set up the rest of the shelters. Okay? So, inflation mechanisms. This shelter actually has 5 different inflation points on our #1 beam here. There's 2 on the outside, and then there's 3 on the inside. We'll talk about the inside ones when we get there. Working top to bottom. This is an SCBA fill valve for pressurized air. So you can use compressed air tanks, you can use an air compressor to hook up to this thing and inflate the shelter. When doing that, this shelter will actually deploy in about a minute to a minute and a half. It is a double lock safety mechanism here. The safety note that I do have for everybody, if you're ever going to use your pressurized air fill, whatever hose you use needs to have a tether with a carabiner or a snap link on it. And that's what this D-ring is for. And that's just for safety in case this lock mechanism is not seated properly and you open that air, that doesn't whip off and hit somebody. Sliding down, I talked a little bit about the safety loop for the SCBA fill valve. This is also where you're going to find your instruction manual and your repair kit pre-attached to the shelter and forevermore stuck to the shelter. Then moving down, this is our primary inflation valve. We call this a push-pull. It says inflate, deflate. It's pretty simple because when I pull off the hose to remove it, I'm pulling out on that valve and I'm in the closed position. If I push in on this valve, i.e. to inflate it or to deflate it, when I push in to seat this and there's a little rib, you hear a positive click. So it's a single muscle movement. You push in, you pull out. It automatically opens or closes that valve. This does have a diaphragm in it. So if the valve is in the closed position like it is right now, the shelter will still inflate. It'll just take about a minute to a minute and a half longer to inflate it because that diaphragm is restricting some of the airflow. But it will inflate. I've got this little safety cap, little rubber safety cap. I always ensure that that's in place. That way, during operations, if somebody walks by the shelter and accidentally bumps the system, it's not going to let air out. Now, this shelter only has about 3.2 psi in it, and that's how that little cap can hold that air in. There's a couple of great features about it being a low-pressure system. Number one, that means it's inherently safe. If anything ever should happen to this airframe, should ever happen to the berm, it's not a concussive type of explosion or air release. Air really is not in a hurry to get out. The second thing about the low pressure, if you ever do end up with some sort of puncture or anything like that, you're going to hear it. You have plenty of time to respond. Again, air is just not in a hurry to get out. The third thing that's great, any holes, punctures, or leaks, your field expedient fix is 100-mile-an-hour tape. That'll patch holes in this shelter because it's a low pressure system. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more specifically about repairing the shelter if you should ever need to do that. So this is our primary fill valve, push-pull valve. Around the corner of the shelter, I already mentioned these, but we've got 4 padded handles. If you ever set this shelter up and you decide it's not quite in the right place, those handles will lift the shelter up and move it. This will retain its 3D rigidity once the shelter is set up. It's not going to collapse on itself if you try to lift it up. So they're very, very easy to reposition. You can just pick it up from all 4 corners, walk it to wherever you need it, and set it back down. Really easy system to reposition. One additional note that I didn't talk about is the shelter was unrolling. If you notice it's unrolling the wrong direction, you can go ahead and slide that roll to point it which way you want it to go. And somebody had asked, do you ever need to help the shelter deploy? No, not really. You can help unfold it if you want to, but you're really just kind of wasting effort. You're not going to inflate the shelter any quicker by doing that. The only time you may want to adjust it or you may want to give it some assistance is in a high wind environment. So this might feel kind of heavy when it's in the bag and 3 or 4 folks are lifting it up, but when you get all this surface area, there's not a lot of weight to the amount of surface area. It will pick up wind. So if you're deploying in an environment that's about 15 or 20 knot winds or higher, it's a good idea to go ahead and unroll it, unfold it, and at least stake down your corners. That way, once the air fills it up and it comes under canopy, this isn't picking up all sorts of wind and starts sailing anywhere. You already have it anchored to the ground. But again, I would only worry about that if you're like 15 to 20 knot winds or higher. Other than that, let the shelter